The year was 1857, and the town of Ashton-under-Lyne, just outside Manchester, was shrouded in the haze of the Industrial Revolution. Smoke rose endlessly from the mills, chimneys crowded the skyline, and the streets bustled with men in suit, stained clothes and women burdened by baskets of laundry. Life was hard, wages were low, and poverty pressed on every doorstep. It was in this world of struggle that a boy was born who would one day carry both ridicule and admiration in equal measure. Mary Wainwright, a modest seamstress, labored for hours in the dimly lit bedroom of her small cottage. Her husband, Joseph, a carpenter with calloused hands and a heart made soft by hardship, waited anxiously just beyond the door. When the midwife finally emerged, her face was pale. She whispered to Joseph, "The boy lives, but you must prepare yourself. He is not like other children." Joseph rushed to see his newborn son. There, swaddled in thin linen, lay a baby with a face like any other, innocent, small, and crying for the comfort of his mother. But below the waist, the midwife's words revealed their truth. The child bore 3 legs. The third leg, slightly shorter than the others, protruded from his right hip. It was neither fully formed nor useless. It twitched and kicked like the others. For a long moment, Joseph said nothing. He merely looked upon the child with a storm of emotions. Fear, sorrow, confusion, but also love. This was his son, regardless of form. When Mary finally asked, "What will become of him?" Joseph took the baby gently into his rough hands and replied, "He will live as God has made him, and I will call him Thomas." News spread quickly through Ashton. In a time when science had not yet explained many of life's mysteries, superstition thrived. Some whispered that Mary must have angered God to bear such a child. Others, half in awe and half in fear, called him a wonder of nature. At church, the congregation stared openly, and a few even suggested that the family was cursed. Yet, for all the gossip and cruelty, the Wainwrights resolved to raise Thomas with dignity. As an infant, Thomas was no different from other babies. He cried, laughed, and clung to his mother's finger with the same innocence as any child. But as he began to crawl and walk, his difference became impossible to ignore. The third leg dangled awkwardly at times, but at other times it supported him. The village children followed him in the street, shouting cruel names, "Monster boy! 3-legged Tom!" Some threw stones. Mary often wept in private, torn between love for her son and the pain of seeing him mocked. Joseph, however, grew more determined. "The world will call him strange," he told his wife, "but we will teach him to work with his hands, to think with his mind, and to walk with his head held high. Let them gawk, he will not bow." By the age of 6, Thomas had begun to show remarkable resilience. He refused to hide indoors despite the taunts. Instead, he followed his father into the workshop, where he learned the basics of carpentry, how to plane wood, hammer nails, and carve with care. His small hands were clumsy at first, but Joseph always encouraged him. "Every man," he said, "must build something with his life. If you can shape wood, you can shape yourself." At school, Thomas struggled. His extra leg made him slower in games and awkward at his desk, where children whispered and snickered. But his teacher noticed something remarkable. Thomas had a quick mind. He loved to read, often staying after class to copy passages from books about explorers, inventors, and philosophers. One day, when asked why he read so much, Thomas answered softly, "Because in stories, no one stares at me." Yet even then, his difference could not be hidden forever. At fairs and gatherings, strangers would lift their eyebrows, whispering as he passed. Some asked his parents directly if they would allow him to be exhibited, as if he were a curiosity to be displayed in a traveling show. Joseph always refused, saying, "My boy is no spectacle. He is flesh and blood, same as you." But poverty was merciless. The mills paid little, food was costly, and Mary often patched the same coat over and over to keep her son warm. It was during these difficult years that Thomas began to realize a painful truth. The world might never accept him fully. Yet rather than sink into despair, he nurtured a quiet strength. He began to tell himself, "If they stare, let them stare. I will show them something worth looking at." One evening, when Thomas was about 12, he sat by the fire with his father. "Why did God give me 3 legs?" he asked. Joseph looked at him for a long time before answering. Perhaps, son, because he wanted you to stand longer than others, to walk where others cannot. Sometimes the burden we are given is not a punishment, but a test, and if you carry it well, it becomes your gift. Thomas never forgot those words. By the time he reached 16, he was taller, stronger, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that unsettled those who mocked him. He still bore the third leg, still endured the whispers, but his father's lesson lived in his heart. Though the world called him a curiosity, Thomas began to believe he was something more than a survivor, a worker, and, perhaps in time, a symbol of courage. The birth of Thomas Wainwright was greeted with shock and superstition, but what began as a mark of ridicule slowly became the foundation of strength. In a society that sought to shame him, he learned that difference is not a curse but a calling. His story's beginning reminds us that the most unusual circumstances can plant the seeds of the most extraordinary lives. As Thomas Wainwright grew from a boy into a young teenager, the world around him became sharper, crueler, and less forgiving. Childhood had given him small shields, his parents' protection, the innocence of play, and the belief that perhaps the jeers of others would soften with time. But by the age of 13, he began to understand the full weight of society's judgment. In Victorian England, difference was seldom met with kindness. Poverty already drew suspicion, and physical deformity carried the heavy stain of superstition. To many in Ashton-under-Lyne, Thomas was not simply a boy with 3 legs. He was a walking reminder of what they feared most: misfortune, curses, and the unknown. At school, the taunts grew harsher. Some children mimicked the way he walked, twisting their hips and limping with exaggerated clumsiness. Others dared him to run, knowing he could not keep pace. During lessons, whispers filled the air. "Freak monster," cursed. When Thomas raised his hand to answer questions, many laughed before he could even speak. One winter morning, when he was 14, Thomas returned home with a torn coat and bruises on his cheek. A group of boys had cornered him in the alley, shouting that his third leg was the devil's mark, before shoving him into the snow. His mother, Mary, wept as she cleaned his wounds. But Thomas, jaw tight, muttered, "They will not break me. I'll not give them that." His father, Joseph, watched quietly, then led him to the workshop that night. The smell of sawdust hung in the air, warm and familiar. Joseph handed his son a block of oak and a carving knife. "People see only what is strange," he told him. "But a man must prove his worth with his work. Carve this wood, Thomas, and show them you are more than their cruelty." That evening, Thomas carved for hours, his concentration a shield against pain. The piece was rough, but it was his. From then on, whenever the world's mockery grew too heavy, he retreated to his father's tools. Each strike of the blade, each polished edge, became a declaration: "I am more than what they say." Yet the ridicule did not remain confined to children. Adults, too, carried prejudice cloaked as curiosity. At Sunday service, families avoided sitting near the Wainwrights. Women whispered behind gloved hands, while men shook their heads as though Thomas's existence was some scandal best ignored. When he walked through the marketplace, strangers stopped mid-step to stare. Some even pulled their children aside, as though proximity alone might taint them. For Thomas, these moments cut deeper than the taunts of schoolboys. The stares, the gasps, the way people stepped away, all reminded him that he was an outcast in his own community. He often asked himself late at night, "Will there ever be a place where I belong?" But hardship also forged resilience. Rather than withdrawing, Thomas developed a quiet endurance. He learned to carry himself with a firm posture, to look back at those who stared, and to speak clearly when others tried to mock him. He found solace in books, tales of explorers who braved uncharted seas, soldiers who marched into battle despite wounds, and inventors who defied ridicule to change the world, if they endured. Thomas whispered to himself one evening, "So shall I." Still, the weight of survival pressed on the Wainwright family. Poverty gnawed constantly at their household. Mary's seamstress work barely earned enough to keep food on the table, and Joseph's carpentry brought in only modest wages. At times, neighbors suggested sending Thomas away to one of the traveling curiosity shows that swept through England. These exhibitions, known as freak shows, displayed people with unusual bodies to paying crowds. Better to make money from his condition than suffer shame, one neighbor muttered bluntly. The thought enraged Joseph, who thundered, "My son is no spectacle! He is not a beast to be sold for amusement." But Thomas, hearing such words again and again, began to wrestle with an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps society would never see him as anything else. At 15, Thomas faced a turning point. One afternoon, while walking home from the workshop, he overheard two mill workers laughing about him. "A pity, really," one said. "Born a freak, he'll never amount to much." Thomas froze, anger and shame burning his chest. For hours that night he stared into the fire silent. His father finally asked, "What troubles you, son?" With clenched fists, Thomas replied, "They see me as nothing, always nothing. How am I to prove them wrong?" Joseph placed a hand on his shoulder. "By living better, Thomas. By working harder. By refusing to be crushed. The world will call you names, but only you decide what you answer to." From then on, Thomas worked tirelessly, mastering carpentry and reading every book he could borrow. Though the community continued to treat him with suspicion, he began to notice small shifts. A widow down the street praised his repair of her broken table. A teacher lent him a volume of Shakespeare, impressed by his hunger for knowledge. These were small victories, but to Thomas they were sparks in the darkness, evidence that worth could shine even through prejudice. Still, the harsh reality remained. Victorian society was not kind to those who were different. Thomas bore the daily weight of ridicule, whispers, and isolation. Yet within that crucible of cruelty, a fire was kindled. For every insult, he carved a piece of wood sharper, studied a page longer, or lifted his head higher. The boy with 3 legs, mocked and shunned, was slowly learning the truth his father had spoken. Dignity is not given by society. It is claimed by the soul. By the year 1873, Thomas Wainwright was 16 years old. He had already endured the cruelty of children, the whispers of neighbors, and the judgment of a society that measured worth by conformity. Yet, despite his hardships, he carried himself with quiet pride, shaped by his father's wisdom and his own resilience. Still, poverty weighed heavily on the Wainwright household. Food was scarce, rent was overdue, and work for his father grew thin. It was during this desperate time that opportunity arrived in an unexpected and troubling form. One evening, while Thomas was helping his father repair a door in the market square, a well-dressed stranger stopped to watch. He was a showman named Mr. Frederick Linton, a man with a sharp eye for profit and a silver tongue. Linton ran a traveling exhibition of curiosities, a popular form of entertainment in Victorian England. His shows displayed the unusual, the bearded lady, the world's smallest man, the tattooed sailor, and even mechanical marvels like steam-driven automata. But above all, people came to gawk at those whom society called freaks. Linton had heard whispers of the boy with 3 legs, and now, seeing Thomas with his own eyes, he smiled with the satisfaction of a hunter finding rare prey. "Young man," Linton said smoothly, "the world is waiting for you. With your remarkable condition, you could draw crowds from Manchester to London. People would pay handsomely just to look at you, and you, in return, would earn more in a week than most carpenters in a year." Thomas froze. His father bristled. "My son is not for sale," Joseph said firmly. But Linton pressed on, speaking directly to Thomas. "Think of your family. Think of what you could provide. You could turn their cruel stares into your fortune. Why let their laughter cut you down when it might feed you instead?" That night, Thomas could not sleep. His father's words rang in his ears. "You are not a spectacle." Yet so did Linton's tempting promise. They were drowning in poverty, and here was a chance, however degrading, to lift his family from misery. Could he bear the humiliation of exhibition if it meant bread on the table? Within weeks, desperation forced his choice. Against his father's wishes, Thomas agreed to join Linton's show for a season. With a heavy heart, Joseph helped him pack a small bundle of clothes. "If you must do this," his father said, "then carry yourself with dignity. They may see you as strange, but do not see yourself that way." The show opened in Manchester under the grand banner, "Come witness the marvels of nature." See Thomas the boy with 3 legs, living wonder. The tent was filled with curiosity seekers, At first, Thomas stood on the stage in silence as the crowd gasped, pointed, and whispered. He felt the old sting of shame flood his chest, but then something remarkable happened. Rather than hiding, Thomas decided to act. He began to move, walking, balancing, even using his third leg to perform tricks. With practice, he discovered he could kick a ball farther than ordinary men, climb small platforms with astonishing balance, and even dance in a way that blended grace with novelty. The jeers turned into cheers. Laughter softened into applause. He was no longer simply an object to be stared at. He was an entertainer. Night after night, the tent filled with people. Newspapers called him extraordinary, a wonder of the age. Children begged their parents to see him. Linton, ever the businessman, promoted him as proof of God's infinite variety. Money poured in, more than Thomas had ever dreamed of. With his earnings, he sent wages home to his mother, who used them to keep the family afloat. Yet even in the spotlight, Thomas never forgot his father's warning. During his performances, he began to speak briefly to the crowds. In a clear, calm voice, he would say, "Some of you come to laugh, some to stare. But remember, every man carries his difference. Mine is visible, yours may not be. Do not despise what you do not understand." These words startled the audience at first, but over time many listened. Some left the tent not only amused but also thoughtful. They came expecting a freak and instead encountered a young man who spoke with dignity. Still, the life of a show performer was not without pain. Behind the curtain, Thomas often felt exhausted, emotionally bruised from being paraded as a curiosity. Fellow performers shared his struggle: the bearded lady who longed to be seen as beautiful, the dwarf who wished for respect beyond his size, the tattooed sailor who admitted he joined the show because no other work would take him. They became his second family, bound by a shared wound. Together, they learned to laugh, to endure, and to transform mockery into livelihood. By the end of 1873, Thomas had become one of the star attractions of Linton's show. He had traveled beyond his small town, seen the bustling streets of London, and even stood before crowds who applauded rather than jeered. For the first time in his life, he felt a measure of power over how the world saw him. But deep within, he knew the truth: the show was not his destiny. It was only a step. He had turned shame into strength. But he longed for more than applause. He dreamed of building something lasting, something that would prove he was not just a curiosity, but a man of worth. The Victorian freak show offered Thomas both humiliation and hope. It forced him to confront society's cruel fascination with difference, yet it also gave him the stage to redefine himself. What began as exploitation slowly transformed into empowerment, for Thomas learned that the same crowds who mocked him could also admire him, if he chose to meet their stares with courage rather than shame. When Thomas Wainwright first stepped into the world of the freak show, shame pressed heavily on his shoulders. Night after night, as curious crowds filed into the tent, he could feel their eyes upon him, judging, laughing, whispering. Some came to gawk as if he were a beast in a cage, others to sneer, and only a handful out of genuine curiosity. For a boy who had spent his whole life ridiculed in the streets of Ashton under Line, it felt as though the cruelty of society had simply followed him under the canvas of the circus tent. At first, Thomas endured it in silence. He would stand on stage while the showman, Mr. Frederick Linton, announced him with grand exaggeration, "Ladies and gentlemen, behold a wonder of nature!" The boy with 3 legs, proof of God's strange design. The crowd would gasp, laugh, or murmur. Thomas would perform his rehearsed steps, balancing and walking in ways that highlighted his unusual form. Yet afterward, when the applause died and the lights dimmed, he would sit alone, hollow, wondering if he had traded his dignity for survival. But one night in Birmingham, something changed. During the performance, a group of drunken men heckled loudly from the front row. They shouted insults, calling him a monster and a devil's child. The words cut Thomas to the bone, stirring up years of buried humiliation. For a moment he froze. The tent fell silent. Everyone watched, waiting to see if the curiosity would crumble. Instead, Thomas did something unexpected. He straightened his back, looked the hecklers in the eye, and said in a steady voice, "You laugh at what you do not understand. You call me a monster, But I tell you this, it is harder to walk with 3 legs than with 2. Harder, but not impossible. You see weakness. I see strength. The crowd stirred. Some laughed nervously, but others fell quiet. For the first time, Thomas had spoken not as an exhibit, but as a man. That night, as he left the stage, he felt a strange fire in his chest. Perhaps he did not have to endure his shame silently. Perhaps he could wield it. From then on, Thomas began reshaping his act. He no longer stood passively under the crowd's gaze. Instead, he used his 3rd leg as a tool, turning it into the centerpiece of his performance. He practiced tirelessly, discovering he could kick a ball farther than most men, balance on stools with unusual grace, and even climb ropes with surprising agility. He transformed what others mocked into feats that amazed. The laughter that once wounded him now became fuel, for he had learned how to bend it into applause. He also began speaking at every show, just as he had in Birmingham. His words were simple, but they carried weight. You come to see a boy with 3 legs. But do not forget, you two are different in your own ways. Mine you can see. Yours you may hide. But difference is not weakness. It is what makes us human. To his surprise, audiences began to listen. At first they came for the spectacle, but many left with a new respect. Some wrote to newspapers about the remarkable young man who carried himself with dignity despite his unusual form. Others brought their children, not just to stare, but to teach them a lesson about courage. Still, the journey was not easy. Behind the curtain, Thomas wrestled with doubt. Was he truly strong, or merely playing the part of strength? Many nights he lay awake, haunted by the fear that the world would always see him as a joke. But then he remembered his father's words, "Only you decide what you answer to." Slowly, he began to believe them. The other performers in the freak show noticed the change. The bearded lady, often mocked for her appearance, told Thomas, "When you speak, they see more than my beard. You give us all dignity." The tattooed sailor added, "You've turned the crowd around, lad. Maybe we're not just curiosities, we're teachers." Indeed, Thomas's courage began to ripple outward. Audiences that once jeered now applauded. Where once people came to laugh, many now left with something deeper, a strange admiration for a boy who refused to bow to shame. He had not erased his difference, he had embraced it. And in doing so, he changed the way others saw it too. By the time he was 17, Thomas had earned enough to provide for his family and even begin saving for a future of his own. But more importantly, he had found his voice. What had once been his greatest humiliation had become his strength. In one memorable performance in London, Thomas ended his act by standing tall before the crowd and saying, "You may call me strange, you may call me different, but I tell you this, if difference is my burden, then it is also my gift. Do not fear what sets you apart. Use it. Turn it into strength." The tent erupted in applause, not of mockery, but of respect. In that moment, Thomas realized he had accomplished something rare. He had taken society's cruelest weapon, shame, and reshaped it into the very thing that lifted him above their judgment. He had proven that a man is not defined by the laughter of others, but by the courage with which he walks his own path, even if that path requires 3 legs instead of 2. Shame could have broken Thomas, but instead it became his forge. In the fire of ridicule, he discovered resilience. In the sting of mockery, he found his voice. And in the cruel spotlight of the freak show, he transformed weakness into power. His story reminds us all that difference is not a curse but a calling. One that, if embraced with courage, can inspire the world. By 1875, Thomas Wainwright had grown from a shy, ridiculed boy into one of the most talked about figures in Britain's traveling exhibitions. The boy once mocked on the streets of Ashton-under-Lyne was now known across cities and towns as the boy with 3 legs. But more than a spectacle, he was slowly becoming something greater, a voice for dignity in an age that seldom offered it to those who were different. When Thomas first joined Mr. Frederick Linton's freak show, he had been little more than an exhibit, something to be pointed at, gawked at, and laughed at. But as months turned into years, he began reshaping his role. Instead of being a passive curiosity, he transformed into an active performer, a young man who could balance, climb, dance, and even deliver speeches that stirred his audience. People did not just come to see him, they came to listen. It was this transformation that caught the attention of newspapers. In 1874, the Illustrated London News published a small article about him, describing him as most extraordinary young man, possessing not only a curious physical condition, but also a rare dignity of character. Soon after, pamphlets advertising the show began including not only his image, but also a quotation from his own words. "What makes me different is not my weakness, it is my strength." Crowds grew larger. Families brought their children not just to stare, but to hear the boy who turned mockery into courage. And for Thomas, each new audience became an opportunity, not merely to entertain, but to plant a seed of understanding. Though he earned more than ever before, Thomas never forgot the poverty of his own family. He sent wages home, helping his mother live more comfortably and easing the burden on his father. But he also began to dream of something greater, a place where people who were different could work with dignity rather than survive as spectacles. In 1875, with the help of his earnings, Thomas rented a small workshop in Manchester during the off-season of the traveling show. There he began taking on carpentry commissions, just as his father had taught him years before. But Thomas did not work alone. He sought out others who struggled to find employment. Men who had lost limbs in factory accidents, veterans returned from war with amputations, and even a hunchback boy who had been turned away from the mills. "You are not broken," Thomas told them as he welcomed them into the workshop. "You are remade, and together we will prove it." The workshop became more than a place of labor. It became a symbol. Passers-by who once mocked Thomas now saw a young man employing others, giving them purpose and pride. The same society that had rejected him was now forced to confront the reality. Those they dismissed as cripples or freaks were, in truth, skilled men with dignity. Word of Thomas's unusual workshop spread, and local newspapers began to describe him not just as a performer, but as a philanthropist in his own right. One journalist wrote, "Mr. Thomas Wainwright, once exhibited as a curiosity, now exhibits something rarer still. The courage to uplift others cast aside by society. His third leg, once a mark of shame, has become the pillar on which others stand." Thomas himself never sought fame, but whenever reporters asked him why he did what he did, his answer was always the same: "Because I know how it feels to be told you are worthless, and I know how it feels to prove them wrong." He continued to perform with the traveling show, but now his act was different. He spoke longer, told stories of his childhood, and urged audiences to rethink their laughter. He reminded them that many among them carried invisible scars, poverty, illness, grief, that were no less heavy than his visible difference. Audiences began to leave his performances not just entertained but moved. For some, his words lingered longer than the sight of his 3 legs. Parents told their children, "See, he is not ashamed. Neither should you be." Workers in factories, scarred by accidents, found encouragement in his resilience. And those mocked for their differences, whether large or small, saw in him a mirror of hope. Not everyone welcomed Thomas's growing influence. Some showmen grumbled that he was spoiling the fun by moralizing to audiences. "They come to laugh, not to be lectured," Linton once scolded. But even he could not deny that Thomas was drawing bigger crowds than ever before. The transformation of public opinion was subtle but undeniable. In towns where once the word freak followed him like a shadow, he now received nods of respect. Children no longer pelted him with stones. Instead, they waved and asked him questions. A minister in Leeds even invited him to speak at a church gathering on the theme of perseverance. Standing before the congregation, Thomas said quietly, "I was born different, and for years the world made me feel cursed. But I have learned this: curses are what we call gifts before we understand them. What you call strange today may be the very thing that strengthens you tomorrow." The audience erupted in applause, and some wept openly. By the late 1870s, Thomas was no longer merely a performer. He was becoming a symbol, a reminder that even those cast aside by society could rise, endure, and inspire. His story spread far beyond the tents of the freak show, reaching people who had never seen him in person. He was invited to schools, churches, and workers' halls to speak about courage, perseverance, and dignity. He never saw himself as a preacher or a philosopher. He always introduced himself simply, "I am Thomas Wainwright, the boy with 3 legs." But through his humility and honesty, he gave hope to those who had none. The transformation was complete. He had stepped into the freak show as an exhibit of shame, but he walked out of it as a beacon of resilience. His 3 legs were no longer just a curiosity. They were the proof that difference, when embraced with courage, could light the path for others. Thomas Wainwright began as a performer who turned his shame into spectacle. But through courage, kindness, and determination, he became something greater, an inspiration. His story teaches us that true strength does not lie in being ordinary. It lies in carrying our differences with dignity, and in using them to lift others higher.